Adventures in Consciousness by Janeroberts, Chapter 7, The Sumari Development. The rich life of the psyche provides the creative ingredients from which we form our daily lives. There are always new possibilities for action and fulfillment just beneath the surface, ready to emerge in response to the events of our days. Such upthrusts of energy and creativity are given precisely when they are needed, if only we are flexible enough to recognize and accept them. Looking back, it's obvious that such stirrings were rustling just below my consciousness during the entire summer and fall. My other universe experience happened on November 4th. On November 15th, Rob mailed the final manuscript of Seth Speaks, signaling the end of a creative endeavor, and on November 16th, my father died. The Sumari development began on November 23rd, at the time seemingly out of nowhere. I didn't know my father well. He died at 67 quickly. I hadn't seen him in several years, so he actually seemed as alive dead as he had ever been, except that no more occasional letters came. Yet I think that his death had something to do with what happened a week later. In fact, all the events of our lives were also probably connected. The earlier death of Rob's father, his mother's situation, and the simple process of continued living in which death plays more of a part as parents die. The psyche's truth, as I'm now learning, deals with a different order of events, yet one that is connected to the ordinary events of our lives. These truths are so richly woven that they often appear dramatically, closed in symbols transformed into art. Our cultural beliefs, unfortunately, make us suspect the psyche's deep knowledge, and we often try to hold down its manifestations to our own limited concepts. The Sumari development is important, if only because it shows so clearly the rise of additional potent energy into organized form, a form that then enriches normal life. The same kind of process happens, I'm convinced, in each of us at various times in our lives, even though the end product may be far different. I don't recall my state of mind that evening of November 23rd. I was sorry about my father's death, but not grieving. ESP class had barely begun. People were laughing and talking, and when I felt my attention drawn outside the bay windows again to the spot where the hole had opened up in Dr. Sam's house, suddenly I had the impression that a group of people were coming out of that other universe into the room, and that their teachers stood just inside, facing me. We seemed to be communicating telepathically, though consciously I couldn't pick up what was being said. The group moved around the room and stood there silently watching. I was quite aware that physically, in our terms, no people stood there, and I granted the validity of my own experience. It was true. I felt their presence, and I saw them, saw in quotes. I saw them with a different kind of vision. Then I heard a babble of voices in strange languages. These seemed to come from far above me. This wasn't physical hearing. Instead, I had the impression of multitudinous sounds, stacked in layers. I saw the sounds, in other words, as shapes. Some formed triangles, some long rectangles. I sensed them as forms and sounds. They were all alien. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with them, but I knew that something was expected of me. It would be impossible, I thought, for anyone to give voice to all that. I didn't think my tongue could make the sounds required. In fact, my tongue felt uneasy. Its muscles wiggled. It seemed incapable, clumsy. The sounds formed words, and all the other languages faded, so that one of them grew more prominent and became louder. The words came so swiftly, though, that it was hard to tell where they started and how to distinguish one from another. Yet I felt I was supposed to give voice to them somehow, to just open up and let them through. I'd be damned if I would, I thought. This kind of experience was completely new to me, and even while it was happening, I was trying to fit it into some kind of context. Unfortunately, the first thing that came to mind was the speaking in tongues associated with fundamental religions. Granted, some valid psychic events may happen under those conditions, but still, they aren't my kind of conditions, and if any yelling, distortions, or tremors, holy or otherwise, were going to be involved, then I was drawing the line. While all this went on in my mind, the sounds seemed to disappear into the background, to dim static, while one particular word, Sumari, grew louder and louder. It was sung rather than spoken. I realized that I was supposed to give it voice. I was intrigued. I hesitated, then decided to write the word down rather than sing it or speak it. I grabbed my pen and paper and scribbled what I got as fast as I could. Other words followed. These too seemed to come to the foreground or come out of the other sounds, which correspondingly dimmed. Then I turned my conscious focus back to the room, and I told my students what had happened, and I started to read aloud what I'd written. Instead, according to class members, I chanted the words in a loud singing voice, flinging the paper to the floor. And here's a list of the words. I'm not going to chant them, but I'll just read them as best I can. Sumari, España, Buena Nafari, Dina Nafari, Lona, Sumari. Then, in a whisper, someone else said, in my voice, I am Supari. You are Sumari. It is your family name. Throughout the ages you have been Sumari. I am acquainting you with your heritage. At that time, a delicious warmth filled my body. It came like a glow from inside, radiating outward. I felt that I can only explain as an astonishing graciousness, a delightful, ancient yet young joy that was directed towards everyone in the room. According to my students, this was reflected in my bearing and my manner as I sat forward in my chair, inclined towards them and addressing them in a gentle eagerness. Then the style of the delivery changed, and I spoke in a different voice, saying again, I am Sumari. You are Sumari. We are Sumari. I am the same Sumari in different guise. The first personality seemed feminine. As the second one spoke, I felt as if large horizontal ridges crossed my forehead. This personality reminded me of an old man and a young boy, at the same time, an ancient boy. As I in quotes, as I was speaking, Sue Watkins had a vision. She saw a three-dimensional figure behind me. It was dressed in gold yellow and nearly reached the ceiling, though she saw the figure in bulk. No features or other details showed. I'd often told the students to go over to Alpha 1 or 2 state of consciousness whenever anything unusual was happening in class. Excuse me. Again, the idea behind all this is that events exist at different levels of reality. So to really understand an event, theoretically, you turn your focus in many directions, just as physically you might walk completely around an object to see it from all sides. When I began to do the chant, then many of my students switched over to Alpha. One woman had an excellent out-of-body experience and slipped easily back into her body again. Another student saw a group of figures. While he thought that distortions were probably involved, he had the impression of seeing 3-part eyes. This was so clear that he drew a sketch of this vision. On seeing this drawing, a girl called out, claiming to have seen the same vision. Everyone was filled with exuberance and energy and questions. Sumari came through several times that night. On each occasion, a kind of smoothness and warmth swept over my body. My arms felt light enough to float. Mostly, I was aware of that odd, exquisite graciousness. Through that focus, I kept observing the room. And I'm going to pause here and just play a bit of Sumari so that you can get a sense of it, and then I'll continue with the rest of the chapter. At one point, I looked at one young man, Phil, and I saw stretched behind him the images of his reincarnational selves. The closest one was a lovely dancer, a girl with a dark skin, an Oriental or East Indian dress. Sumari recognized Phil and cherished him as himself, and as all the other reincarnational personalities also. She saw them in him, and him in them. The same applied to everyone in the room. When I looked at Betty, I saw the pioneer woman right behind her. The emotions felt by Sumari were so rich and multidimensional that my own usual feelings seemed shallow by contrast. Emotion in stereo. But these feelings were also steady, rich, sure, and beautifully coordinated. There was an excellent blend of intellectual and emotional experience. I felt as if I were becoming aware of a new kind of all-inclusive personhood that was my rightful heritage and everyone else's. Yet when class was over, I wondered again about the language. One of the students mentioned the ancient Sumerians whose historical existence is documented. But I was sure that I wasn't speaking any language from another civilization, not in usual terms. And what was meant by the phrase, "We are acquainting you with your heritage," or "You are Sumari"? I went over to discuss the whole thing with Rob, only to find that he'd had an experience of his own. He'd been typing up the last Seth session in the small second kitchen off my studio. Suddenly, his vision seemed to dim. It was hard for him to see the paper or his own hand. And then he saw a head shape, bathed in beautiful, colorful, jagged outline. It was brilliant, almost like fire, with shoots of light on all sides. Rob felt at this time that it had something to do with my father. Later, he sketched the vision. Was it really related to Sumari? I wanted to know what was going on, so the next night we held a long session. Our friend Sue Watkins even came over and recorded it so that Rob would be free of his usual note-taking chores and be better able to ask questions. The session lasted 2 hours. Sue typed it up, and it was 13 pages of double-spaced script. First, Seth talked about Rob's vision. He said that Rob, in his own way, was picking up the energy connected with the Sumari development. And here's a quote from Seth. You were perceiving a core of energy that radiated outward and infringed upon this reality, hence the fragmented area about it, you see, and the seemingly jagged effect of the vision. You were concentrating on your perceptive abilities and energy almost in the same fashion as a laser beam, for example, concentrates energy. So the vision that you received, while it was microscopic, was still brilliant and radiated strong energy. Now, such a vision is not only something that you see and that intrudes upon this reality, but it has its effects upon your reality as well. You perceive the appearance of the vision, but its other effects escape you. The concentration of energy itself is highly important and changes the behavior even at the atoms and molecules within the neighborhood of its appearance. Now remember what I told you about black holes and the concentration of energy? Such occurrences allow you unusual exchanges of energy from one system to another. They are fountains, therefore, of new energy. And their very intrusion into your world activates that reality in different fashion, usually in a quickening, stirring, transforming fashion. An activation, therefore, rather than slowing down. There are, incidentally, levels of motion so fast that they attain what seems to be a level of complete peace, where motion is not perceived. Beyond such levels, the motion is perceived again, and the period of peace seems over. Now, in the case of your vision experience last evening, the image itself activated the air in the atmosphere. In that activation, however, it achieved finally a level of seeming peace, where you do not perceive it, but in which it still exists. Then Seth said that the Sumari could be compared to a psychic family or to a guild of consciousness who worked together through the centuries. He made a joking reference to my dislike of brotherhoods, alive or dead, but added that Sumari could be called a brotherhood in which we are now ready to take up conscious membership. Seth himself was in great form, addressing himself jovially to Rob, who had time to ask many questions, and Seth emphasized that the Sumari were only one group or guild of consciousness, and after a serious discussion of their purposes and characteristics, in which he stressed Sumari initiative and creativity, Seth grinned broadly and said, "They don't hang around to cut the grass, though." The main point seemed to be that the Sumari were primarily creators, nonconformists, with superb use of energy who initiated systems of reality, but weren't temperamentally suited to seeing a long project through, perhaps. They'd leave that to other groups who were gifted with different kinds of abilities and tendencies. In a burst of husbandly intuitive insight, Rob asked Seth about my strange appearance at the hospital with Dr. W. Actually, Rob wanted to know why I hadn't asked this myself. Seth said that he thought I should answer that question, but then he confirmed the suspicion behind Rob's query. Dr. W. was a Sumari. He had been involved with me in past lives when we had a highly personal work relationship. We'd been beloved colleagues. In answer to other questions, Seth said that the Sumari development had been latent since the beginning of our sessions, and that my ability to translate some ancient speakers' manuscripts had been dependent on my acceptance of this new aspect. The speakers are mentioned in Seth Speaks, where they are described as teachers, physical and non-physical, who help our race through the centuries. Rob wanted to know if all speakers were Sumari, and Seth said that each guild had speakers. Seth's session intrigued me, yet its implications made me think twice. Did I want to go ahead with this new development or didn't I? He'd mentioned that the Sumari experience would expand in quite unexpected ways and to my benefit, but speaking for Seth was one thing, an accepted part of my life and work. As usual, I decided to go ahead while allowing myself the full right to criticize whatever happened or stop whenever I chose. As for Dr. W., I felt that our meeting might have been one of the triggers for Sumari, and I could hardly deny that I'd felt what I'd felt when we'd met. But that was that. I had no curiosity about his present situation. In fact, I knew that our past relationship, whatever it was, deserved its own privacy. It didn't belong in our current lives. And Sumari did develop almost in the same way that the first Seth sessions did, so that within a month a variety of phenomena emerged, more or less full-blown. In the following class, for example, I began talking and singing in Sumari. We had what was called a Sumari circle, when one of my students spontaneously stood up, walked in a circle about me, and began chanting with me in Sumari. This was supposed to represent an ancient initiation ceremony. As Sumari, I drew diagrams which I explained carefully in the Sumari language. At the time, students nodded their heads. Yes, they understood. It was perfectly plain. But when I came out of trance, no one remembered what it was they had understood or what the diagrams meant. The uprush of class energy was obvious. Students reported many out-of-body episodes and class dreams. But so far, Rob hadn't heard Sumari. I decided that I wasn't going to go ahead with it until Rob had a chance to observe Sumari and give me his opinion. So that night we set up a recorder. I was Sumari almost instantly. She began by pointing to objects in the room and giving Rob their Sumari names. Then Rob was expected to repeat the word. Before long, Rob found himself speaking Sumari spontaneously. Then, haltingly, he began to sing with me, correcting him as we went along. When the session was over, we were both astonished. The next day, I played back the tape and I wrote down the words of the song phonetically. This took a good deal of time. As I was doing this, however, I began to get the English translation. The placement of the lines or sentences seemed to come naturally, but sometimes I get a translation of an entire phrase or just one word. The song was called Song for Beginners, and as you'll see later, it showed up in a different context in my novel, The Education of Oversoul 7. At least as far as I'm concerned, however, one of the most surprising elements of Sumari involved the vocal effects. I've had no musical training of any kind outside of singing in a church choir for a while as a child. That particular choir didn't involve any training either. You just yelled out the words as loudly as you could, and that was that. As Sumari, though, I quickly began to sing in a lovely, musically true voice of considerable range. The songs or scores showed far greater musical sophistication than I have on a normal level. Two of my students who are musicians have put some of these songs to music. I can't even read notes, so I can't understand the scores, but one is reproduced in chapter 15 for those who do. In class, the songs weren't just sung. My whole body is used as a vehicle of expression, and often some pantomime is involved. Almost at once, for example, Sumari dramas were established where song and motion were used to act out a reincarnational episode. The characterization and emotional meaning of the drama are absolutely clear, despite the fact that English isn't being used. In this regard, the songs represent emotional realities that are often very meaningful to students. These are also structure, that is, although the performance is completely spontaneous, the result is organized, poised, true to the requirements of meaningful discourse or communication. I had a trance language then. Was it the language of the unconscious? Was I involved in a process that somehow paralleled the birth of language in any culture? Was my experience a private but perfect replica of what happens when a species begins verbal communication? What could the language really be used for? If I was going to be able to translate it, then what did I need it for in the first place? I asked the questions all right, and as winter came upon us, one by one, the answers began to arrive. And that's the end of that chapter. Chapter 8 will be called Songs of the Silver Brothers. And now, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to play a bit of Sumari at the end. Now, I'll just tell you, it's about, it's about 3 minutes long. And so you can come back here anytime and listen to it. And I won't say anything at the end, so you can drift off into your own, imaginings, or into Alpha 1 or Alpha 2. Okay? So here we go.